Well, I was born in South Wales into a small mining village in the southeast of Wales, and very much a working class community. Everybody living around me was a coal miner or a steel worker or a factory worker of some kind. My mother was a housewife, so it wasn't a particularly affluent, but by no means poor background. And Wales is, I think, frequently misunderstood or not understood at all in the United States. Wales is one of the four constituent nations of the United Kingdom. England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And a lot of Americans ask me questions like, well, you're from Wales, that's somewhere in England, isn't it? Which is something that most Welsh people react really badly to. So I consider myself very much Welsh and British, and I've been a green card holder for 3 decades. The South Wales Valleys are a very distinct part of Wales. It's a kind of curious hybrid of rural and urban. It's very mountainous. I think most Americans will regard our mountains as hills, and we get a bit sensitive about that. But it's a part of the world that was prominent in the Industrial Revolution, and working class culture and trade unions were very, very important to the environment in which I grew up. I was educated in a state school to which I could walk in the next village. I have taken my American wife to these two villages, and she insists they're the same place, that's close together. But Welsh identity can also be pretty parochial. I'm from Pontywayn. I am not from Cwmcarn. I am not from Abercarn, even though these places are all within 1 mile. I went to university in Wales. I studied politics or political science at the University College of Swansea. But after graduating, and I graduated into a very bad economy in 1983. It's part of a downturn in the Western economies transatlantically. And I decided to travel for a year. And so I backpacked around Europe and ended up living for 6 months in Israel as a kibbutz volunteer. And when I came back to South Wales was in a very difficult position at that time, because we were then, this is 1984, in the middle of a year-long miners' strike, which the miners eventually lost. And that sent the South Wales Valleys into a major economic downturn. And it was pretty clear that economic opportunities in South Wales were going to be few and far between. And I wanted to continue my education anyway. And I applied to, and I'm glad to say I was accepted into the London School of Economics to study international relations. And I think that's probably where my immigrant story begins, because I mentioned earlier on that the UK is a multinational state. It has 4 nations within it. And I felt very much like an immigrant in London. I didn't have a London accent. Londoners are much more kind of vibrant, energetic people, used to big crowds, and I had many experiences of being first in the bus line and last on the bus because I couldn't do the pushing and shoving that comes with living in a big city. So that really was my first immigrant experience, I think. It was also my first exposure to cultural diversity, because the South Wales Valleys were culturally very homogenous. I think I can honestly say that I didn't have a one-on-one conversation with a person of colour until I was at university. Okay, but when I moved to London, of course, that's a very, very multi-ethnic city. In fact, 50% of the London population today is non-native born. And so I got exposed to cultural diversity at the age of about 22, 23, and I've valued it ever since. And I think moving to London made a kind of conversion in me from being a Valleys boy to being a city guy. And I've lived in cities ever since, and I've spent a lot of time living in cities in various places of the world, and preferably in city centres. I actually love being in big cities. When I finished my master's degree, I got a job as a speechwriter and an economic researcher for a trade union, the Amalgamated Engineers Union. And I worked for them for a couple of years. I then also worked for a consumer lobby organization called the National Consumer Council. And then I worked for the Trades Union Congress, which is the British equivalent of the AFL-CIO in America. And at that time, I was very involved in politics, very involved in the British Labour Party. And when the British Labour Party lost yet another election in 1992, I got out of practical politics and went back to the London School of Economics to write my doctoral dissertation. And to fund myself as a graduate student, I took on a series of teaching jobs, one of which was with the Workers' Educational Association, which is a charity that teaches adult education, and I've been involved with those for many years. And it was via a connection with the WEA that I got to teach for Birkbeck College, which is part of the University of London, in their extramural studies department. So again, I was teaching evening classes for adults. And through that connection, I landed a job, one of the best jobs I've ever had, teaching for an American university consortium in London. And I absolutely loved doing this, taking Americans around London and other parts of the UK, including my native South Wales. But the consortium that I was working for included the University of Puget Sound and Pacific Lutheran University. And as a result of my work with that consortium in London, I got offered a visiting position at both UPS and PLU simultaneously. And so I came over here for 6 months, met my wife, and stayed for 30 years. So that's basically what I mean by saying this is a series of accidents. There are so many possible breaks in that chain that the whole thing is really very improbable, but I'm very glad it's worked out the way that it has. When I moved here, I'd traveled extensively in the United States previously. In fact, as an undergraduate, I worked at a summer camp in Maine and earned enough money to afford what was then a $100 Greyhound bus ticket that took me from Portland, Maine to Los Angeles, California. And so I saw a lot of the country. And I made several trips in between as well until I moved to Tacoma in the mid-90s. So it wasn't a big culture shock. It's certainly not the case. And also my entry into Tacoma was eased by the fact that I knew professors and students through this consortium in London. So I had a kind of community I could join immediately upon arrival. And not all immigrants have that, so I was very lucky in that respect. If I had been asked to pick a city in the United States to move to, it wouldn't have been Tacoma because most British people are not aware of Tacoma. It's overshadowed in the British mindset by Seattle. Okay, and I've talked about how it's a series of accidents that brought me here. So I can't say there was a Tacoma draw, but what's kept me here is certainly employment. I've worked very happily at Pacific Lutheran University and I have a fantastic relationship with my students. I've enjoyed that absolutely enormously. And so the principal reason why I've stayed is vocational. This is where my work is. But I absolutely love living in the north end of Tacoma, so much so that my wife and I are now living in our third house on North 19th Street. Okay, so we're very, very comfortable in the north end of Tacoma. But what I should, in all honesty, say is that I think I still regard myself as living a kind of transatlantic life. So the pattern for the last few decades for me has been to be in Tacoma for about 9 months of the year and elsewhere, usually Britain, for the other 3 months. And my wife and I are both very, very fond of the city of Manchester in the northwest of England. So in a typical year, I spend 9 months in the northwest of the United States and 3 months in the northwest of England. I teach political science, and my particular interest is in the history of political thought. And I've taught that pretty consistently throughout my PLU career. I became interested in politics at about the age of 16, and I think when people start to get interested in politics, that's around about the time that it happens. And I think a major sort of influence on me was meeting a local politician, a man called Neil Kinnock, who was the Member of Parliament from my part of South Wales. And he went on to lead the British Labour Party into 2 general elections, and was something I think I could claim of a political mentor to me. So when I went to university with a plan to study history, I got diverted into politics very, very easily. And I think that my relationship to the news and current events can actually be called an addiction. The very first thing I do in the morning while the kettle is boiling to make my first cup of tea is I read The Guardian and the New York Times. I get asked a great deal about the contrast between British and American culture, and that culture gap is huge, much bigger than many people anticipate. And I first began sort of interpreting Britain to American students when I was teaching on for the consortium in London, and teaching British culture to Americans is really quite challenging. I have tried to explain the British Constitution to many American students, and I tell them things like, the king is effectively above the law, and theoretically if the king committed murder he could not be arrested because the powers of the police derive from the crown. And the reaction of American students is one of disbelief, basically. It was Oscar Wilde, I think, who said that Britain and America were 2 countries separated by a common language. And I think that there's a great deal of truth in that. Because we share the same language, we tend to assume we understand each other better than we do. So you put British people in America and they can be really disorientated by the culture, and the other way around. So British culture is very dynamic, it's changing, and I think that the differences between the 2 countries may have been modified over the post-World War II period as Britain becomes more and more Americanized. I mean, it is subject to a great deal of American cultural influence through film, television, and music. But the distinction between the 2 cultures is something that I probably think about every day. And it's very difficult to make sweeping generalizations about those. You have to get into the weeds a little. But it is important, I think, for the 2 countries to understand that there is something of a gap of communication, and it takes work to overcome it. Well, on this question of how do I remain connected to Britain, well, I still spend a lot of time there. As I've said, about 3 months of the year there, very often. But also, my house is a kind of Britain in miniature. If you look at the artwork on the walls, it has works by L.S. Lowry, the famous Manchester or Salford artist. My video cabinets are full of DVDs from British film and television. I read the British press. My day begins with the reading of The Guardian and the New York Times every day. And so, I think I have created a little island of Britishness and Welshness in my own home. And the internet has made it, over the last 30 years that I've been here, easier and easier to keep on top of what's happening in my own country. There are some recurring American misconceptions about the British. First of all, Americans think we're all English, and you'll get a very sharp response to that from Welsh people, Scottish people, and people from Northern Ireland. I think Americans believe us to be much more invested in our monarchy than we actually are. I am constantly amazed at how my American students know so much more about the British royal family than I do. So yeah, there are those misconceptions. I think that the American view of Britain is sort of skewed towards England, and it's skewed, I think, more to sort of upper class life. So the popularity of British TV shows like Downton Abbey, I think, is part of that idea that we're all posh and aristocratic. And when I hear Americans trying to do British accents, the accent they always shoot for is a very posh, refined English accent. The immigrant experience it always comes with difficulties. My own story is remarkably low in terms of difficulties, and so I don't compare my experience with people who have come to the United States and to Tacoma through, I don't know, economic need, destitution maybe in their own country, refugee status. So it's very difficult to generalize about the immigrant experience. It's a very broad spectrum, and I freely admit that I'm on the more privileged end of that spectrum. I am aware from talking to my students, and PLU is an increasingly international student body. I'm very much aware that other people's experiences of coming here have been far rockier than my own. There was actually one major obstacle to my coming to the United States, and this was because the Clinton administration at this time was in conflict with a Republican-dominated Congress, and my attempts to get a US visa were seriously disrupted by a government shutdown. And in fact, my wife had to get, who was already here in Tacoma, had to get her congressman to intercede on my behalf to actually get me a visa. So there was a major bureaucratic impediment to my coming here. And then, of course, you have to go through the green card process. And that's really quite onerous and really quite expensive, too. Very, very bureaucratic, but once I've secured it, it's given me basically all the rights of citizenship other than to vote. So, well, I think in terms of contributing to Tacoma, I think that my job is a big contribution in itself. But I've in the time that I've been at PLU, I've done a lot of work sort of after hours with students, so usually organizing discussion events on things that are going on in the world and so on. So I've put a lot of my, if you like, community service into the university itself. As a green card holder, I can't vote, but I am able to make political donations and to participate in political campaigns, and I have done that for much of the time that I've been here. So I have been politically involved. I also like to support the local arts community as much as I can, largely through attendance. And I'm a very loyal member of the Grand Theatre, which I think is one of the best things about Tacoma. To have our own little art house cinema there in the North End is just fantastic. I think those are my major inputs. Another way I think that I've made a contribution to the community in Tacoma is my admittedly very recent involvement in the World Affairs Council of Tacoma. And what I particularly like about that organization is that its remit is to try and engage the public on international events. And we have lots and lots of data which shows that of everything that happens in the political world, it is foreign affairs that people know the least about. So I think the World Affairs Council, nationally and locally here in Tacoma, is doing a very important job there, and I'm glad to be a part of that. Do I have any advice for people coming to the United States or Tacoma now? I'll be very careful what I say here, but of course, the political climate on the question of immigration is changing. And I think that at the moment, the United States appears to be a more difficult place to come as an immigrant and to settle in. But that's a work in progress. I don't know how long that will last. But clearly, my advice to anybody who wanted to be an immigrant to the United States today would be certainly to be incredibly scrupulous in all of your paperwork, and to be aware that that's going to be subject to the kind of scrutiny that it maybe not has been in the past. On the positive side of American culture is its emphasis on individual freedom, the ability of people to reinvent themselves here is really quite remarkable. And that's a major contrast, I think, with European cultures where people are much more path dependent. It can be very, very difficult for them to veer away from the course that they are sort of set on by the circumstances of their birth and upbringing, whereas I think American culture affords a lot more opportunities to reinvent yourself. I've always admired that about America. Also, I think America has a health and fitness culture that my country doesn't, and I admire that a lot. Americans tend to look after themselves better. I think that's really quite remarkable. And it's an entrepreneurial society. It's economically very successful, and what I really must say, and this is very important to my own story, is that the kind of job that I have at Pacific Lutheran University basically doesn't exist in the United Kingdom, because I am a tenured professor, and university tenure was abolished in the 1980s in Britain. So my wife and I are leading a life as an academic couple that would be incredibly difficult to replicate in the United Kingdom.